The courtroom air was thick with the scent of cheap pine cleaner and simmering contempt. As Eleanor Vance stood before the judge, her posture rigid against the tidal wave of smug glances from the other side of the room, her husband, Gregory, flanked by his impeccably tailored lawyer, Mr. Thorne, and her own in-laws, the entire Vance clan, watched with expressions that ranged from pitying to outright gleeful. The bankruptcy hearing, a final, public unraveling orchestrated by them, was proceeding exactly as they'd planned. For 3 years, since her beloved grandmother's passing, Eleanor had been drowning, working 2 jobs while Gregory searched for his passion. Her modest teacher's salary bled dry by his strategic investments and his family's constant, condescending loans. Now, they'd petitioned to force her into involuntary bankruptcy, claiming her financial incompetence was a danger to Gregory's future. "Your Honor," Mr. Thorne's voice was a silken dagger. "Mrs. Vance has proven incapable of managing even basic household finances. Her reckless spending has left my client, a man of budding entrepreneurial spirit, shackled to debt. The Vance family, pillars of this community, simply cannot allow this instability to tarnish their name further." A soft, mocking chuckle rippled from Gregory's sister, Celeste, her diamond bracelet catching the fluorescent light. Eleanor's own court-appointed attorney shifted uncomfortably, offering a weak whisper about medical debt and marital strain. But the narrative was set in stone. Eleanor, the poor, overwhelmed black wife from a modest background, was the problem. Gregory met her eyes then, his face a mask of performative sorrow. "I just wanted to help her, Your Honor. We tried everything. But some people, they just can't be helped out of their circumstances." The words, a vicious echo of private arguments, hung in the air. The judge, an older man with a weary demeanor, peered at Eleanor over his glasses. "Mrs. Vance, these are severe claims. Your husband's family has even offered to cover the legal fees for this proceeding out of charity. Do you understand the gravity of your situation? This bankruptcy will follow you for a very long time." Eleanor's knuckles were white where she gripped the cheap wooden podium. She remembered the loneliness of the past years, the quiet dismantling of her spirit. Gregory's family had never welcomed her, their dinner table conversations laced with microaggressions about her people's work ethic, their surprise at her eloquence. They'd laughed when she'd mentioned her grandmother's stories of a far-off home, dismissing them as the ramblings of an old woman from the rural South. They'd mocked her for spending her last savings on a seemingly futile trip to a lawyer in New York after her grandmother's will reading, which had revealed only a single, ancient-looking key and a letter in a language they'd deemed gibberish. That trip, they'd claimed, was the final proof of her fiscal insanity. As she opened her mouth to speak, to utter some feeble defense, Gregory's mother, Patricia Vance, sighed audibly, a sound of profound inconvenience. "We did try to include her, Your Honor. We offered financial literacy courses. But it's a cultural thing, I suppose. Some are just more accustomed to chaos." The humiliation was a physical burn, a scalding wave that started in her chest and flooded her cheeks. She saw the court reporter's sympathetic wince, the bailiff's averted gaze. They'd painted her into a corner of pathetic stereotype, and she'd been too exhausted, too grief-stricken, to fight the brushstrokes. The judge was about to bring down his gavel, to seal her fate in a public record of failure, when the massive oak doors at the back of the courtroom crashed open. The sound was so violent, so utterly out of place in the subdued procedural theater, that everyone, including the judge, jolted. A man in a suit that seemed to be woven from midnight itself stood silhouetted against the hallway light, his presence an electric shock to the room's stale atmosphere. He was followed by a phalanx of 6 equally severe-looking individuals, men and women whose precision and poise screamed of power and lethal capability. They moved not with the hurried scramble of latecomers, but with a terrifying, synchronized inevitability. All conversation died. The lead man's eyes, a sharp, assessing gray, scanned the room before landing on Eleanor. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Mr. Thorne found his voice first, irritation coloring his tone. "Your Honor, I must protest this disruption. This is a closed bankruptcy hearing." The stranger ignored him completely, walking down the center aisle with a calm authority that parted the space before him. He stopped at the bar separating the gallery from the court proper and addressed the judge directly, his voice a low, resonant baritone that carried without effort. "Judge Harold Whitmore, my name is Alistair Finch. I am the lead counsel and chief executor of the Eleanor estate. I apologize for the intrusion, but this proceeding is predicated on a profound and, I must say, legally actionable fraud. We have just filed an emergency motion for dismissal and a countersuit for malicious prosecution, defamation, and financial coercion." He held up a slender, titanium tablet. "The filing, with all pertinent documentation, is now in your court's system." The judge, bewildered, tapped at his own monitor. His eyes widened slowly, then dramatically, as he began to scroll. Gregory erupted. "What is this? Who are these people? Eleanor, what have you done now?" Alistair Finch turned his gaze on Gregory, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You will address her as Ms. Adisa, or you will not address her at all." The name hung in the air, foreign, and waited. Eleanor felt her breath catch. Adisa, her grandmother's name, the name on the old letter. Finch turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, the petitioner, Gregory Vance, along with his family, have engaged in a systematic campaign to impoverish and isolate my client, Eleanor Adisa Vance, née Adisa, in order to seize control of her assets. They were operating under the catastrophic misapprehension that she had none." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "They were wrong. The motion before you includes documentation from the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the private treasury of the sovereign nation of Azania, confirming that upon the passing of her grandmother, Nana Adisa, and the completion of a 3-year period of familial mourning and personal discernment, Eleanor Adisa became the sole living heir and beneficiary of the Adisa Trust." He finally looked at Eleanor, his stern expression softening a fraction into something resembling reverence. "The trust, Your Honor, whose total valuation, as of this morning's market opening, is approximately $1.7 trillion, the number detonated in the silent room. It was too vast to comprehend, a seismic shockwave that left mental rubble in its wake." Celis' mocking smile froze into a grotesque rictus. Patricia Vance's hand flew to her throat. Gregory simply stared, his mouth agape, his brain visibly short-circuiting, trying and failing to process a figure that belonged to nations, not to people, and certainly not to the woman he'd just labeled a financial incompetent. "Mr. Thorne." The silken dagger now turned to brittle ice, stammered, "This is preposterous. A fraud, Your Honor. This is clearly some kind of desperate stunt." But Judge Whitmore was no longer listening to him. He was scrolling, his face pale, pulling up official seals, verified documents from global institutions, whose logos were rarely seen in a small county bankruptcy court. A document from the U.S. State Department granting diplomatic-level recognition to the trust's executors. A portfolio list that included controlling stakes in global tech conglomerates, mineral rights to half of Southern Africa's rare earth elements, and ownership of the very bank the Vances used for their old money accounts. The judge removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes as if to clear a mirage. "Ms. Adisa," he began, his voice hoarse, "is what I'm seeing here accurate?" Every eye in the room slammed into her. The humiliation of moments before was still a raw wound, but now a new sensation flooded it. A fierce, rising heat that was part ancestral vindication, part sheer, unadulterated shock. She thought of her Nana Ya, her gnarled hands holding the key, speaking in hushed, reverent tones of a homeland that waited, of a responsibility so great it had to be hidden, protected, until her granddaughter was ready. The gibberish in the letter was Twi, a royal dialect. The key was symbolic. The 3-year mourning period was a final test of character, a trial by fire she had endured in this den of wolves. Eleanor drew herself up to her full height, the weight of generations settling on her shoulders not as a burden, but as armor. She looked not at the judge, but at Gregory, at Patricia, at Celeste, meeting their stunned, dawning horror with a gaze of glacial clarity. Finally, she spoke, her voice clear and steady, ringing in the hushed courtroom. "Yes, Your Honor, it is." For a long, suspended moment, the only sound in the courtroom was the faint, digital hum of the judge's monitor and the ragged, disbelieving breath escaping Gregory's parted lips. The colossal number $1.7 trillion seemed to echo in the sterile air, a phantom sum too gargantuan for the cramped, wood-paneled room to contain. It rebounded off the walls, shrinking the once imposing figures of the Vance family into something pitiful and small. Patricia Vance's hand, still clutching her pearl necklace, trembled violently. The click of the beads a frantic counter-rhythm to the sudden, deafening silence. Celeste's smug superiority had melted into a slack-jawed gape, her eyes darting between Alistair Finch's impassive face and Eleanor's transformed posture, as if trying to reconcile the woman she'd derided as a charity case with a reality that upended her entire world. Mr. Thorne, the architect of this legal ambush, was frantically scrolling through his own tablet, his face leeching of all color, moving from arrogant pink to a sickly parchment white as he accessed the same damning, globally verified documents now before the judge. The bankruptcy petition, his masterpiece of petty destruction, now looked like a child's spiteful scribble on the corner of the Mona Lisa. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat, the sound like gravel shifting. "Counselor Finch," he began, his voice carrying a newfound, cautious respect. "The court acknowledges receipt of your filings. The scale and provenance of these documents are unprecedented." He turned his bewildered gaze to Eleanor. "Ms. Adisa, I must ask, were you aware of this inheritance during the course of your marriage?" It was the question that hung in everyone's mind, the linchpin of the entire, shocking reversal. Gregory found his voice, a desperate, reedy thing. "Of course she wasn't. This is insanity. Eleanor, tell them this is some mistake. You lived in our guest house. You borrowed money from my mother for your car repairs." The memory of that day, Patricia handing her a check with a sigh of long-suffering generosity, now tasted like ash in Eleanor's mouth. She looked at her husband, really looked at him, seeing past the handsome, familiar lines of his face to the stranger beneath, the man who had watched his family mock her, had joined in with subtle barbs of his own, who had sat in their home and meticulously helped her list her paltry assets for the bankruptcy filing, all the while knowing he was engineering her ruin. "I was aware," Eleanor said, her words measured and clear, cutting through Gregory's sputtering, "that my grandmother's legacy was more than memories, but the terms of the trust were explicit. A 3-year period of anonymity and discernment, following her passing, was required before the estate could be transferred. It was a time for reflection, to ensure the heir was grounded in the values of our family, not corrupted by the prospect of its wealth." She allowed a faint, icy smile to touch her lips. "You all mistook my discernment for desperation. You interpreted my adherence to my grandmother's wishes as financial ineptitude. The trip to New York you mocked was to meet with Mr. Finch's associates, to begin the quiet, confidential process of verification. The gibberish in my grandmother's letter was her native tongue, instructions meant for me alone. The revelation was a second, more intimate blow. Their ridicule had been not just cruel, but profoundly ignorant, a display of their own smallness." Alistair Finch took a single step forward, commanding the room's attention once more. "Your Honor, the petitioners, in their attempt to exploit and publicly humiliate Ms. Adisa, have unwittingly accelerated the timeline. The mourning period concluded at midnight. The full, unencumbered assets of the Adisa Trust are now legally and irrevocably hers. Furthermore, their actions today filing a malicious petition based on knowingly false premises while she was, for all intents and purposes, one of the wealthiest individuals on the planet constitute a fraud upon this court, an actionable harm against my client." He gestured to one of his associates, a severe woman with a sharp bun who immediately placed a physical stack of documents on the clerk's desk. "We have filed a counterclaim. We are seeking not only dismissal with prejudice, but full restitution for all legal fees, damages for emotional distress at a magnitude commensurate with the scale of the defamation, and a preliminary injunction freezing all assets of Gregory Vance, the Vance Family Holdings, LLC, and Thorne and Associates, pending a full forensic audit. We have reason to believe funds acquired through coercion from Ms. Adisa during the marriage have been commingled with their business accounts." The dominoes began to fall with terrifying speed. Mr. Thorne shot to his feet. "Your Honor, I object. This is a circus. These claims are outlandish. We had no knowledge. Ignorance, Finch replied coolly, is not a defense against malice. Your petition is a matter of record. Your client's statements, accusing Ms. Adisa of cultural financial chaos, are in the transcript. The evidence of their coordinated pressure is documented in emails, and bank transfers you yourselves provided as exhibits of her supposed debt. You built the case. We are merely demonstrating its true foundation. Panic, raw and undignified, began to crack the Vance family's polished facade. Gregory's father, Charles Vance, a man who had rarely spoken to Eleanor directly, stood up, his face mottled with rage and fear. This is an outrage. We are a respected family. You can't just barge in here with these fairy tales about African kingdoms and expect to ruin us. The word kingdom hung in the air. Finch didn't even glance at him. The sovereign nation of Azania is a recognized non-territorial sovereign entity, Mr. Vance, with a seat at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Its wealth accumulated over centuries from royal mining concessions and global investments is very real, and it is, as of today, under the sole stewardship of your daughter-in-law. He let that sink in. Your respect was a performance for a local audience. Her authority is recognized by world governments. The judge, looking profoundly out of his depth, raised a hand for silence. He studied Eleanor, seeing her anew no longer a beleaguered woman in a discount suit, but a poised figure of immense, latent power who had endured a gauntlet of humiliation with startling grace. Ms. Adisa, Judge Whitmore said, his tone formal, given the extraordinary nature of these developments, I am granting the motion to dismiss the involuntary bankruptcy petition immediately. The court finds it was filed in bad faith. The countersuit and request for injunctive relief will be heard in a separate civil proceeding. He brought the gavel down with a definitive crack. This hearing is adjourned. The sound was both an end and a terrifying beginning. The moment the formal proceeding dissolved, the courtroom erupted into chaos. Gregory stumbled around the petitioner's table, his eyes wild. Eleanor, Ellie, please. This is a misunderstanding. We can talk about this. It's still us. He reached for her arm, but one of Finch's security detail, a man with a calm demeanor and watchful eyes, interposed himself with a subtle shift of his weight, blocking the path. Eleanor looked at the man she had loved, who had shared her bed and her dreams, and felt nothing but a vast, hollow cold. There's no us, Gregory, she said, her voice devoid of the warmth he'd once known. There's only the woman you tried to break, and the consequences of your family's greed. Patricia Vance pushed forward, her dignity in tatters, her voice a shrill plea. Eleanor, think of the scandal. Think of what this will do to Gregory's future. We can keep this quiet. We'll withdraw everything. Just be reasonable. The word reasonable was the final spark. Reasonable, Eleanor repeated, her composure finally showing a fissure through which white-hot anger flashed. You called my grandmother's legacy gibberish. You told a judge my culture was chaos. You laughed as you took everything from me, assuming I had nothing of value to give. Now you ask for reason? She took a step toward them, and for the first time, the Vance family flinched back from her. Your understanding of value is a decimal point in a ledger you will never comprehend. My grandmother's wisdom, the language you mocked, the history you ignored, that is my inheritance. The money is just a tool. Alistair Finch touched her elbow gently. Ms. Adisa, your car is ready. The press is beginning to gather outside. A statement has been prepared, but your guidance is needed. The real world, with its cameras and headlines and global financial ramifications, was pressing in. Eleanor gave one last, sweeping look at the tableau of ruin she was leaving behind. Gregory, shattered. Patricia, weeping angry tears. Celeste, staring blankly at her now irrelevant diamond bracelet. Mr. Thorne, already on his phone in a frantic, hushed conversation. They were a frozen portrait of a world that had just ended. She turned her back on them, following Finch's team as they formed a protective cordon around her. As she walked out of the courtroom, past the stunned bailiffs and gaping clerks, she didn't feel the giddy thrill of revenge. Instead, she felt the immense weight of the key in her purse. No longer a cryptic heirloom, but a symbol of a door swinging open onto a terrifying, magnificent future. The humiliation was over. The reckoning, for all of them, had just begun. The sleek, armored Maybach glided away from the curb, a silent fortress separating Eleanor from the cacophony outside the courthouse. The shouted questions of reporters who had materialized like storm-driven birds, the flashing cameras trying to capture her face through the tinted glass, and the final, blurred image of Gregory being jostled on the steps, his mouth moving in silent pleas that no longer held any meaning for her. Inside the serene cabin, the world was hushed, the only sound the faint whisper of climate-controlled air. Alistair Finch sat across from her, his earlier severity softened into a look of solemn assessment. The initial statement has been released, confirming the transfer of the Adisa Trust and dismissing the bankruptcy claims as fraudulent. The markets are already reacting. Vance Holdings stock has been halted after a 40% plunge. The injunctions are in place. Their assets are frozen. He said it all with the calm detachment of a surgeon reporting on a successful procedure. Eleanor nodded, staring out at the familiar streets of the city that had been her cage, now looking utterly alien. The weight of the last hour, the last 3 years, pressed down on her, not as a crushing burden, but as a dense, potent core of resolve. She was no longer Eleanor Vance, the struggling wife. She was Eleanor Adisa, heir to a continent's worth of legacy. And her first decisions would be surgical, precise, and absolute. "The house," she said, her voice quiet but firm in the quiet space. "I want it emptied. Everything that is mine, every photograph, every book. The small carving my grandmother gave me retrieved. Everything else, every piece of furniture they chose, every painting that reflected their taste, is to be donated. Then list the property for sale. I never want to see it again." Finch made a note on his tablet. "It will be done. Your temporary residence is secured at the Azania Consular Suite in the tower. It is sovereign territory, and security is total. You will have peace there too. Acclimate." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "There are also immediate requests. The Chancellor of the Exchequer from the UK, the CEOs of 3 major tech conglomerates where the Trust holds controlling stakes, and the Secretary General of the UN have all requested introductory calls. Your schedule, however, is yours to command." Eleanor absorbed this, the scale of it threatening to overwhelm her. But she thought of Nana Ya's hands, steady as she poured tea, telling stories of kings and queens who carried their people's hopes. This was her carrying now. "The calls can wait a day. There is something else first. The funds Gregory and his family took from me, every loan, every coerced investment, every dollar spent from my salary that supported his lifestyle. I want it traced, quantified, and retrieved down to the last cent, not out of need, but as a matter of principle." That money was given under false pretenses. A faint, approving smile touched Finch's lips. "The forensic accountants are already embedded. We will also be pursuing damages for emotional distress and defamation. The civil suit will be filed tomorrow. The Vance family's financial and social capital will be eradicated." The word eradicated should have felt violent, but to Eleanor, it felt like justice, a necessary clearing of poisoned ground. As they drove, she looked at the city's landmarks: the art museum Patricia Vance chaired, the country club where Charles held court, the boutique where Celeste had laughed at Eleanor's outdated purse. Each was now a monument to a world that had just lost its access. Her phone, a new, encrypted device Finch had provided, buzzed, not with a call, but with a flood of messages from numbers she didn't recognize. Names from the periphery of her old life, all suddenly desperate to reconnect. She ignored them. One message, however, was from a blocked number. "Ellie, for God's sake, you've made your point. Let's talk. We're family." "Greg." She deleted it without a response. Family. The word was a hollow shell. Her family was a wise grandmother in the soil and a nation waiting across the ocean. The car descended into a private underground garage beneath the city's tallest, most exclusive tower. A private elevator, requiring a retinal scan from Finch, whisked them directly to the penthouse. The doors opened not onto a hotel suite, but onto a sun-drenched oasis of modern African art. Living walls of lush greenery, and floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city and the sea beyond. It was serene, powerful, and unmistakably hers. Waiting in the living area were 2 people, a dignified older woman in elegant Ankara robes, and a sharp-eyed man in a military-style suit. "Ms. Adisa," the woman said, her voice warm and resonant. "I am Imani, your chief of staff and cultural liaison from the Royal Council. This is Kojo, head of your personal security detail. We are here to serve you and the legacy of Nanaya." The use of her grandmother's name, spoken with such reverence, was the first thing that truly pierced the numbness. Eleanor felt a lump form in her throat. For 3 years, she had been made to feel ashamed of that name, of that history. Now, it was a title of honor. "Thank you," she managed. "There is much to learn." Over the next hours, in that peaceful area above the city, the abstract concept of $1 trillion crystallized into tangible reality. Imani presented her with sleek tablets outlining the Trust's humanitarian initiatives, fully funded universities being built in West Africa, a global network of clean water projects, cutting-edge medical research institutes. The wealth wasn't a hoard. It was an engine for staggering good. Kojo outlined security protocols and the diplomatic status she now held. Finch returned with updates. The Vance family's primary accounts were frozen, triggering margin calls on their business loans. The social media world was ablaze with the story, the narrative swiftly turning from a salacious bankruptcy to an epic tale of comeuppance. Journalists were digging, and the Vance's past discretions were beginning to surface like bones in a receding tide. As dusk painted the sky in shades of violet and gold, Eleanor stood at the window, the sprawling city lights twinkling below like a bed of captive stars. She felt a profound calm settle over her. The humiliation had been washed away, not by money, but by truth. The tension had snapped, leaving her with a clear, open path. The power was no longer a secret. It was a mantle she was learning to wear. She knew what she had to do next. "Imani," she said, not turning from the view, "I want to draft my first public statement, in my own words. And then I want to plan a trip, home, to Azania. I need to see the soil my grandmother told me about. It will be arranged," Imani said softly, pride in her voice. Down in the city, in the now silent, darkened shell of the Vance family home, Gregory sat amidst the opulent furniture that was no longer his, staring at his phone, which was buzzing relentlessly with calls from creditors, business partners, and furious relatives. The final email from his father's lawyer had been clear. The family was bankrupt, their reputation in tatters, and they were all pointing fingers at him. He had lost everything: his source of wealth, his social standing, and the woman he had foolishly believed was his inferior. The full, devastating scope of his miscalculation settled in his gut like a physical sickness. He had not just lost a wife, he had provoked a sovereign power. He looked out his window, up at the glittering tower that now housed his estranged wife, a sliver of light in the vast, dark sky. The distance between them was no longer emotional or social. It was galactic. He was on the outside, in the cold, looking up at a throne he had helped to polish with his own contempt. And he knew, with a certainty that left him hollow, that he would spend the rest of his life in that chilling shadow. A footnote in the legendary rise of Eleanor Adisa. Above, Eleanor finally turned from the window. She walked to a desk where a single, old photograph of her grandmother had been placed, next to a fresh tablet and a simple pen. She picked up the pen, feeling its balanced weight. The story of her humiliation was over. The story of her purpose was just beginning. She smiled, a true, peaceful smile for the first time in years, and started to write.